Hi everyone, this is part 2 of our topic 1 Indian culture, and we're now going into Indian wars. Just as a reminder here, we are now in the middle section, and 1862 is marked by Little Crow's War, our first war here. Okay, so in this middle section here, 1862 to 1876, there are 3 conflicts that you have to know about. And we start with Little Crow's War. The way that I have set these slides out, you should know the cause here at the top of the conflict, the consequence, and then the events in the middle are set out into a beginning, a middle, and an end to mirror that narrative account style question, just to break it up a little bit for you. So, Little Crow, he is the chief of the Dakota Sioux in Minnesota. Minnesota has lovely farmland. There are about 50,000 Indians living there and about 6,000 whites living there. This extra population is really putting a heavy demand on the hunt in Minnesota, so there are pressures on the food source there. In order to ensure that his tribe survives, Little Crow agrees to move his tribe onto a reservation for $1.4 million plus an annuity, so that's a yearly payment or provision of money and resources worth $80,000. So he gives up 24 million acres of land. Now, in our middle section here, the big problem with this is the Sioux are in debt. They have been taking resources from warehouse traders on credit, and because they have not paid this money back, their yearly payments, their provisions are withheld from them, and this puts them in quite a lot of stress because there are pressures on food already in this area. Some of the warrior brotherhoods leave, they go to hunt, and they are further punished by the government by stopping provisions for doing this, for not sticking to their reservation. Meanwhile, white settlers have started to encroach a little bit more on this land. They are taking the best farming land along the Minnesota River, and this is disrespecting that first Fort Laramie Treaty. This boils over then in terms of tensions as warrior brotherhoods continue raiding warehouses and taking food for the tribe. At the same time, crops are failing and lots of the tribe find themselves eating grass in order to survive, so they are very much starving. Whilst the government are distracted by the civil war, Little Crow and his warrior brotherhoods, they steal from warehouses to give food to the people. They burn down some of the buildings here. They attack towns, they attack some of the army forts, and they end up killing about 600 settlers and soldiers who were on that land there. The US Army retaliate quite strongly to this, and lots of the Sioux are rounded up and prepared for execution. President Lincoln steps in and says that only 38 of them should be executed because it could be proved that they were involved with some of these actions. As a result of this then, obviously this is a loss for the Plains Indians, and they are forced onto an even smaller reservation called Crow Creek Reservation. The mass execution of those 38 was something that caused tension, further tension between the whites and the Indians, and they were forced away from their sacred land, which undermines their way of life. Now, that story is quite long, there's quite a lot involved there, so I have diluted it down to about 5 things that you really should remember when you're doing your revision. So you might want to just pause the video here to take this down. Remember, these is your kind of bare basics, and that should help you remember other bits of the story. So 24 million acres, they gave away for $1.4 million. They were $200,000 in debt. They had to sell more of the reservation because they were starving and eating grass. The Indians killed 600 whites, and as a result of this, they're forced onto Crow Creek, which is poor land, and they were not successful there. The second conflict that you have to know is the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. So just a reminder here with this date, 1864, the American Civil War is still very much going on, so the US government is slightly distracted here. Now, this conflict is a result of gold being found in Colorado. The Fort Laramie Treaty had guaranteed this land in Colorado to the Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians, and this was broken immediately as soon as gold was found. At the Fort Wise Treaty in 1861, 10 chiefs agree that they will move onto a reservation in the east of Colorado. This will move them away from the gold and allow the prospectors to get there safely. As we know, in Indian structure, they do not all have to agree with what the chief has said. So dog soldiers were like a type of warrior brotherhood. They reject this treaty and they remain in their old land, and there is kind of hit and run style fighting going on for quite a long time here. This leads us into our middle section where Chief Black Kettle agrees to meet some army commanders at Sand Creek after 3 years of fighting has led the government to decide that they'll try and negotiate. Now, the territory's governor is called John Evans. He's quite an unpleasant man. He believes in kill and destroy when it comes to Indians, and he instructs Colonel John Chivington to attack Black Kettle and his tribe. So this is what Chivington does. He has 700 men, and he claims it was his 700 versus 1,000 warriors, Indian warriors. But the reality is that he attacks these Indians, and they're mostly made up of women and children, and he massacres 130 of them. They'd put a white flag on display and it was ignored. They took body parts of the victims and they displayed them and put them on sticks and went and showed them off in local saloons. The dog soldiers retaliate by attacking army forts. They kill settlers in the Colorado Territory. Now, the government really needs to get a grip on this because the Civil War is going on. They cannot be distracted. So they agree to a treaty with these Plains Indians that they will give them compensation for the massacre and that the Indians will move on to a slightly better bit of reservation land. As soon as the Civil War is over in 65, the government completely backtrack on this promise and give them a reservation that is half the size. And there is this quite ominous term that is also agreed as well. It is that Indians can remain on the reservation, or they can leave the reservation to hunt as long as the buffalo remain. So all this means that later on the government can remove the buffalo, and it means that Indians can't use this hunting ground anymore. So a consequence of the Sand Creek Massacre, obviously this makes tensions between the US government and the Indians far worse, and it leads to more aggressive military action towards the Indians. So again, there is lots to that story. I would be stripping that right back here to these 6 points. We've got gold found in Colorado. The Treaty of Fort Wise was an agreement to move to a reservation. The dog soldiers disagree with this. Colonel Chivington attacks the Plains Indians. The government promised land and compensation in a bid to negotiate. And as part of this, there is an agreement that they can leave the reservation to hunt as long as the buffalo remain in those hunting grounds. This is your final Indian conflict in our middle section here, 1862 to 1876, and this is Red Clyde's War. So it is worth mentioning that this one is just outside of the American Civil War, so it's not really impacted by that. So this one begins once again with the discovery of gold. So Red Clyde is the chief of the Lakota Sioux in Montana, and gold is found in Montana. 2,000 prospectors suddenly descend on Lakota land, and they take a shortcut from the Oregon Trail called the Bozeman Trail to get to this gold. And again, this disrespects the Fort Laramie Treaty, the first one. In the middle section then, Red Clyde is invited by the government to negotiate the terms of maybe allowing some prospectors on the trail or purchasing the land. However, he remembers the Sand Creek massacre and he knows that he can't really trust the government here. Plus, he noticed that building materials have started to be brought into the area, which makes him distrust the negotiations. It looks like it's a foregone conclusion. The US government are going to do what they want no matter what. So, Chiefs Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse join Red Clyde with Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors so that they can be stronger. So they do unite there. Red Clyde has about 3,000 Indian warriors versus about 700 US soldiers here. Now, Captain William Fetterman is a young captain and he's trying to prove himself here. They are helping a wagon train transporting wood. They are guarding that from any attacks. And as they are there, he is very strictly warned not to attack the Indians without being told to do so. And he is warned that they have a scouting trick where they send a few Indians to kind of taunt some US soldiers, and then they are drawn into a chase whereby they are led into an ambush. So he knows that this is a thing. Forgetting that, he is led into an ambush called the Fetterman's Trap, and he and his 80 men are killed, and the Lakota Sioux surround Fort Kearny, which is an army fort, on the Bozeman Trail, and they stop any travellers passing through. This is a huge embarrassment for the US government. By 1867, the government have produced a report that says engaging in these conflicts is far too expensive. Let's try and negotiate reservations instead. So they changed tact slightly, and government policy is now going to be all about negotiating. So the government here do negotiate and they agree the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. Now, the Second Fort Laramie Treaty agrees that the Bozeman Trail shortcut will be closed to those white travellers, and also in return for this, Red Clyde and his people will be given a huge amount of land called the Great Sioux Reservation, and that will be theirs for eternity. He agrees to this. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse do not agree with this, so they leave. So a consequence of Red Clyde's War is the signing of the Second Fort Laramie Treaty, closes the Bozeman Trail, gives them the Great Sioux Reservation, and the US government policy is now a focus on negotiation and reservations rather than a military approach. So if I was to reduce that right down, I would be looking at these four things here. 2,000 prospectors on the Bozeman Trail, Captain Fetterman is led into an ambush, all 80 of his soldiers die, the Second Fort Laramie Treaty leads to the closing of the trail and the Great Sioux Reservation. This is now our final section of our conflicts, and there are two for you to remember in this part. So this falls in our conquest period of time, which is 1876 to 1895, and 1876 is the Battle of Little Bighorn. So again, they are laid out completely the same here, and the Battle of Little Bighorn is all due to gold once again. There is a theme here. So General Custer is a very experienced general, and him and his 7th Cavalry are protecting railroad builders, but as he's there, he decides he'll do a little bit of gold prospecting himself too. Now, gold is found in the Black Hills in South Dakota, and the government decide they're going to offer $6 million. They want the gold that's there. The Sioux reject this because, well, you simply can't put a price on ancestral lands, and they begin to attack prospectors who are encroaching on their land. Thousands of these Sioux warriors leave their reservations and they join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse to fight against being forced onto reservations. They are given 60 days to return to reservations. However, as some of them then do return because they might not necessarily want the conflict with the army, it becomes impossible because there is deep snow. The US government are quite antagonised by this. 7,000 Sioux are sat outside of their reservation. Chief Sitting Bull is noted to have said, "The whites want a war and we will give it to them," so they prepare. By the summer, Custer's army are sent to escort the Sioux back to their reservation. I say escort, they are forcing them. And as he is rounding some up, he notices in the valley of Little Bighorn there are 2,000 warriors, and he decides to launch a surprise attack with just 200 of his men. But he is spotted, so the Indians know that he is coming, and him and all his 200 men are killed due to his bad choices there. So, a consequence of this, even though it is a victory for the Plains Indians, they are very harshly punished. The US government adopt a policy of assimilate or die. So there is no more negotiating about land. It is the Plains Indians, they have to change, they have to become like the white farmers, they have to no longer be nomadic, or they simply will just be killed. So we have a very, very harsh policy by the US government. They also are forced to give up those black hills, otherwise resources are not going to be given to them. They will be put into starvation, and they are forced onto reservations. There is no negotiation about where or about leaving them. Horses and weapons are confiscated by them, and they have to live under military rule. So their ability to live their normal culture and traditions is taken away from them, as they are strictly watched by the government. To remember these, there are 4 points here. Gold is found in the Black Hills. They're offered 6 million. The Sioux leave the reservation, are told to return after 60 days, or given 60 days to return. Custer tries to take on 2,000 Indians with his 600 men, and it leads to a policy of assimilate or die. This is when it becomes very, very harsh for Plains Indians. And our final conflict here is the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. And this is the final push to move Sioux onto reservations. So it begins with the Dawes Act, which has also been enacted at this time, that the government's line now is that they must assimilate. So this is a way of trying to make the Indians assimilate. Remember, the Dawes Act is like the Homestead Act for Indians. They get their 160 acres and they are encouraged to become farmers. Lots of them don't know how to farm, the land that they're given isn't very good, they don't know how to use the tools, so often they are not successful, they sell up, or the government is finding that the tribes are working their way back to each other again. The government cut Sioux rations because they are trying to make them less reliant, they are trying to force them to assimilate. On top of this, there is a drought in 1890, which means there is widespread starvation. The Sioux are simply not thriving. Now, when people are in a very desperate situation, they start to believe in supernatural beliefs sometimes. These are known as millenarian beliefs. And the Sioux believe in something called a ghost dance. And they believe if they perform this, that their ancestors will return, a flood will wash away all of the whites, and things will return to the way they were before. The US government don't understand this, and they interpret this ghost dance as a war ritual. They think that the Indians are getting ready to declare war or to fight or have a battle. So they are ordered back onto the reservations, and during one of these moves, Chief Sitting Bull is killed. This spooks quite a lot of Sioux, who run away and join another leader called Chief Bigfoot. The US Army find Bigfoot and the followers, and they are escorting them back to Wounded Knee Creek. One of the Sioux warriors is resisting being disarmed, and the tribe begin the ghost dance. This really scares the US Army, and it leads to them opening fire because they misunderstand what's happening. After 10 minutes, the smoke clears, and 250 of the Sioux are dead. lots of them are women and children here. So a result of this was the belief that Indians were too hostile, too wild, they could not be controlled, and they could not be assimilated. So the government announces shortly after this the end of the permanent Indian frontier. There's no more real negotiations for reservations. There is no Indian land and white land. All of the land is simply up for grabs now. So it's the end of the permanent Indian frontier. There is no Indian territory. The Americans can settle anywhere they like. To summarise this one then, the Sioux are forced onto reservations, the ghost dance begins, 250 killed in 10 minutes. Easy. In our final section, we have the destruction of the Plains Indians' way of life. And the 3 points here you're looking at is the removal of the buffalo, reservations, and education. So buffalo are hunted to near extinction here. They are exterminated. And the reason the government are motivated to do that is they know once the buffalo are gone, the Indians are going to find it very hard to survive. So industrialised cities are using buffalo hides. They are paying quite a lot of money, but they only need the hides. Everything else is wasted. So hunters are incentivised to go out using the railroads. They're delivered to the plains and they use rifles to shoot as many buffalo as they can. 4.5 million are wiped out over 2 years versus the 1 million that Indians would hunt to survive. Also, treaties that promised they could leave reservations as long as the buffalo remained when they were going hunting. It meant that these ended because the buffalo no longer survived. In terms of reservations, they also really do meddle with the Plains Indians' ability to survive. So the Dawes Act worked like the Homestead Act, but it was for Indians, and it tried to break up tribes by splitting families and forcing them to become farmers. They also used the Dawes Act to justify shrinking reservations bit by bit, and they sold off the land. This meant that the Indians could no longer live their nomadic lifestyles. Political power is also taken from the tribes as functions that are previously performed by chiefs are taken away from them, and that is things like dealing with law and order within the tribe. That's handed over to special courts. Special courts are then aligned with federal law courts, so Indians are treated in the same way as everyone else in America, or their courts are meant to run in the same way. And some Indians even join an Indian agency police in terms to keep an eye on tribes in the area, and this ensures them a good standard of living, and the permanent Indian frontier is eventually closed. Being forced onto reservations means they can no longer be nomadic, and being unable to govern themselves removes their traditional structure of society. Finally then, education. The government really do go after the children here. They remove children from the parents, and this is going to make it very hard for tradition and culture to be passed down. They are also at these schools going to make Indian children learn English. They're going to ban them from speaking their own mother tongue. They are going to raise them in a westernized style, and those children aren't going to understand their culture and their traditions and where they're from. The schools are quite tough, they're military style, the children aren't treated very well, lots of them die in custody of these schools. In 1887, there are 2,020 children at boarding schools, these are Plains Indian children, and 2,500 in day schools. So it's a way to stop tradition from being passed down.